It was just before summer when I moved into the small, nondescript town of Millhaven. After a somewhat dramatic breakup, I needed a reset, something slower, quieter, where I could rebuild my life away from the unwelcome reminders of city living. I found an old, two-story house on the outskirts of town, nestled behind a row of dense pines. It was the kind of place that people drove by without a second glance. The first few days were unremarkable. The townspeople were reserved but polite, the kind of folks who nodded a greeting but rarely engaged beyond pleasantries. My mornings were often spent unpacking and arranging the house, while afternoons took me out to explore. One evening, as I was settling into the routine of my new life, I noticed something curious. Standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of boiled pasta, I glanced out of the window. Across the field at the edge of the pines was an old man, bent, mostly obscured by shadows, just standing there. I stared for a while, my hand resting on the spoon like an anchor. Was he a neighbor? Was he merely passing by? There was no reason for anyone to be back there, not as far as I knew. Before I could make up my mind to wave or maybe go outside, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the tree line. I told myself he must have been someone taking a shortcut. I went to bed thinking nothing more of it. Later that night, however, I was woken up by a noise. It was like the scraping of branches against glass, but with a rhythmic quality that didn't quite belong to the wind. From my bed, I could see the moonlit outline of the window, nothing more than the silhouette of waving trees and the slightly unsettled sky. I convinced myself it was the pine needles shifting in the breeze and eventually fell back to sleep. I awoke the next day under the weight of an uneasy feeling. It lingered throughout breakfast and teased the back of my mind like a half-remembered dream. I returned to the window but saw nothing unusual, just the house, the field, and the line of trees. Several days passed with no further event, but the unsettling sensation remained, growing stronger as if it was fermenting inside me. I dismissed it, reasoning it was just the ghost of a once busy lifestyle, clashing with the sudden stillness of this new place. One Thursday, having completed the mundane task of grocery shopping, I found a note tucked under the wiper blade of my car. The handwriting was erratic, almost confused, the ink smudged and frantic. It simply read, "Don't let them in." I looked around the parking lot at the sullen faces of the other shoppers and saw no one who seemed remotely interested in my existence. I felt a rush of heat rise in my cheeks. From embarrassment or anger, I wasn't sure. Stuffing the note into my pocket, I shrugged it off as a prank. Over the following weeks, that unsettling sense deepened. Unexplained things began to happen. The front door left ajar in the mornings when I knew I'd locked it, a musty smell permeating the second-floor hallway, a delicate teacup missing from its set without a trace. I tried reasoning each event, ascribing them to forgetfulness or harmless mishaps. The house, though old, was sturdy and absent of drafts, yet the whispered rustles and faint creaks played with my imagination. Deciding to get to know my neighbors, I visited a woman named Martha who lived 2 houses down. In her late 50s, she had a genial way about her that I found comforting. I brought up the old man I'd seen by the pines, but her response was a knowing frown. "Probably just old Ted," she said, sipping her tea, but the way she avoided my gaze suggested more than her words conveyed. When I pressed for details, she simply shook her head. "Since his wife passed, he hasn't been quite right," she said after a pause, choosing her words carefully like someone navigating a minefield. "But it's nothing to worry about." I left with more questions than answers. That phrase, "it's nothing to worry about," echoing ominously in my mind. Late one night, as I buried myself in bed with a book to fend off insomnia, I heard a sound that stood out from the usual chorus of the creaky house, a faint scraping like fingernails against wood. It seemed to come from above. My breath caught in my throat, my body freezing in its warmth cocoon like a prey under threat. The sound repeated, growing louder and then fading abruptly. When silence resumed, it was even more oppressive than the noise. I felt an irrational resistance against heading upstairs to check it out. Instead, I lay there, the book slipping from my numb fingers as adrenaline danced through me, every muscle tense, and waiting for what? I didn't know. The next day, I convinced myself to get a grip, determined to solve whatever puzzle this feeling represented. Searching the walls, the ceilings, the spaces behind the furniture, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Not until I glanced up at the attic hatch. The cord dangled innocuously from the ceiling, but a slight movement caught my eye. I pulled it, lowering the steps, and climbed with caution. The attic, swathed in dust and the thick smell of neglect, revealed nothing at first glance. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed the boards scattered around seemed to be arranged deliberately, as if someone had been there recently. Determining this changed nothing, I climbed down, pulling the hatch tight closed behind me. Whatever presence I felt looping around my life here, it was intangible but unignorable. 2 nights later, my peace was shattered again, this time by the sound of breaking glass. My feet moved before conscious thought had a chance to intervene, adrenaline writing terror into a grotesque urgency. In the hall, I found the source in the kitchen. One of the windows was smashed. Crunching over glass, I saw the moonlight casting silver patterns over the shards like a woven tapestry. Instinct had me pulling out my phone to call the police, but my gut warred against the idea. Something about it felt premature, like a reaching hand into the dark. Instead, I stayed by the window, watching, waiting for someone, something, to show themselves. The police arrived shortly after, having been called by a neighbor awakened by the noise. They basked me in a suffocating bubble of questions and procedure, their uniforms bringing a discomfort of their own. Their presence stirred the unease into a near dread, but their search of the property revealed nothing but the intrusive shiver of my own apprehensions. In the short weeks since moving, my sense of safety had stripped away like bark, layer by layer, until I felt raw, exposed to both real and imagined dangers. I didn't want to be that person, the one the town whispered about, the outsider who unraveled. Hoping for relief, I visited Martha again. Our conversation once again meandered like a half-remembered tune, but I found her more forthcoming. I mentioned the note on my car, the sounds, the broken window. Her response was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a slow sadness. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ted was like you once. He heard things, saw things, tried to understand them." "Understand what?" I asked, but she only shook her head. "It's not just an old house," she said finally. "It tends to bring about what you least expect." I wanted to protest, to demand, but the words curdled in my throat under her solemn gaze, such that all I could do was nod mutely. By now, sleep was a luxury I could barely afford. I lay in bed each night, observing every sound, every shuffle and susurration too ethereal to pin down. It felt like they were whispering chaos into my ears, an unseen presence moving so vaguely beyond the edges of perception before it could solidify into anything real. In the thickest part of one such night, my breath quickened under a recurring dream, a slow, heavy tapping, the grinding of teeth in wood, a shadowy figure, standing indifferent to my silent pleas. I pulled myself awake from these visions each time, drenched with the weight of a terror I couldn't name. Then came the evening where, steeling myself from my own fears, I waited, camera in hand, aimed at the pines. As dusk devoured the day, the landscape looked draped in the uncertain glow of twilight. The silence was punctuated only by the sounds of nature settling in for another night. I watched and waited, eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the old man vanish weeks before. Minutes turned sluggish, felt like hours, until a figure emerged slowly from the tree line, a shadow of aged skin and bones. When he stopped, his head whipped suddenly towards me, and the breath in my lungs stalled. Arm poised to wave, engage, demand explanation, I felt the weight of the camera turning from curious accessory to shield against this foreboding reality. I blinked, and the figure seemed to shift, shrinking into the darkness, becoming one with it. Suffused with a contrived bravery, I stepped outside into the night, skirting carefully around the broken glass. The moon was bright as I crossed the field with the inconsiderate yawp of wind whispering past, resolving within me the notion that I needed to confront whatever this was. Arriving at the edge where pine trees rose like sentries marking a forbidden border, I hesitated. The world seemed to tilt slightly, a fluid, feverish sense sweeping through. And then, in a wicked waltz between rationality and panic, came the voice, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Go back inside." It wasn't aggressive, no more than a breath of sound, but it held a gravity that stopped me cold, like strings command a marionette. Then, before the questions could cluster sufficiently that I might rebel against obedience, the stillness had broken, the whisper gone. I returned to the house, closed the door, and bolted it like a fool who's forgotten what they're running from. The night trembled outside, ever watchful, and I found myself dwelling beneath its abandoned glow without choice, tethered to a rigged heart beating a melody of unsung fears. Days later, when dusk once again stretched its long fingers over the town, seeds of doubt solidified into resolve. I knew I had to leave, escape before something either within or outside struck a blow I couldn't recover from. As I drove away, leaving behind the old house with its pocket of pines, I allowed myself one last look in the rearview mirror, a parting glimpse at the shadowy angle of the trees, the slow drift of smoke from a neighboring chimney. Half expecting to see a figure standing beneath them, watching me go, I saw nothing, only the faint stirring of branches beneath a silver moon, and the open road ahead, whispering relief and uncertainties into the twilight.